Hello! Welcome to Why Not Both? My name is Pam Schaefer, and I'm a musician and therapist in Los Angeles. Why Not Both is all about how our multiple passions inform our identity, and this season we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine and produced by Laura Studeris. If you like what you hear, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform and come spend time with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, and that is both on Instagram and on Twitter. For this episode, I had the utter delight of getting to talk to Nichole and Bim from Thirst Aid Kit, which is an amazing podcast, which you should all binge listen to right now. They are fantastic writers and human beings, and I hope that you enjoy our episode. Welcome to Why Not Both, where we talk about noise interruptions. Sirens, helicopters, chainsaws, like one does.
Exactly. 2020 in a nutshell, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. Time soup. My podcast used to be about how people balance multiple passions, and I guess it still is, though now it's sort of a how do you balance gestures vaguely to everything.
Right.
Yes. So I guess that is what I would want to start off with is, how are both of you juggling all the things?
I have good days and I have bad days. There are days when it doesn't happen often, but every so often I am ahead of schedule. Mm-hmm. And it shocks even me because I'm like, oh, this is nice. Like I haven't really had this since January. This is nice. This is good. I'm delivering my deliverables at a reasonable hour. This is great. But generally speaking, it's a real feeling of what day is it? You know, like Nichole and I sometimes joke that sometimes the thing that gives a week structure is when we have a new episode out. So we know it's Thursday. It must be Thursday. And then it's kind of like, okay, so let me work backwards. That means that thing I did was Tuesday. And that means the thing I'm going to do tomorrow is going to be on a Friday. Okay, good to know. And that's like a really solid, like it's a joke that's not really a joke, but it does help to kind of orient me. Yeah. And just put me in a place of just like, okay, so I know that if I have to do this today, then here are the other things I have to do on other days. And that really helps to kind of keep the equilibrium.
Definitely. Nichole and I were speaking to that right before you hopped in on the Zoom, that it's like, there's this unmoored feeling where it's like, how do you even know if you're ahead or behind of something when there aren't time markers?
Right.
Oh, no, I'm like, you did take a journey to the land of wet eyes today, but it sounds like perhaps you needed that journey. It's hard sometimes, especially like Bim was saying that like there's like new horrors lurking behind each door, that it's like when to know when to let go, and to actually just let it out and be like, okay, the crying, it's overtaken me. We're running.
Right. Yeah. And also knowing, I think, what kind of outlets works. Because, you know, it's not only a case of wet eyes, right? Like, there are times when you just have to kind of yell at something or just go to bed at like 5 p.m. and come out the next day and kind of like, we'll try it again tomorrow. And I think understanding what works for you, when and how to respond to things, it's all part of the same journey, I suppose, of this year and all the things that have happened this year. Is like, I think a lot of people for the first time maybe are understanding something about their own body's responses for the first time, you know, like, oh, this means X and this means Y. And when that happens, I'm going to do Z. And I think those are things that it's horrible to learn it this way, but hopefully in years to come, they remain a useful tool to have in your own arsenal to understand your own emotions a little bit better. I know I'm coming off as incredible therapy speak right now, but it's not wrong, I don't think. I think there is something to be said for cataloging. You know, like when we were kids, I know many people were encouraged to keep a diary or to keep a journal or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's useful, I think, still to kind of like go back and read something that felt so big and like it was never going to end in the moment. And then you come back to it a year, 2 years, 5 years later, and you're like, wow, I do not remember this thing that I thought would define my every waking moment thereafter. I don't even remember it, let alone has it colored how I view life or whatever. And I think it's the same thing for your own body. It's just like, oh, this results in this thing. And now that I know that, I can be a little bit more cognizant of that going forward, so that I don't surprise myself again, like, what's this? I think that's paying attention, I think, is part of it. It's only a small part of the many other things you have to do in your life, but it's definitely an important part.
I don't think I'm juggling very well. We were actually just recording today, and I had a crying spell, which I never do. I do not cry in public or where people can see me, unless it's like you're my mother. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of had to have a little case of the wet eyes today.
Oh, that's the most endearing way I've ever heard someone refer to crying.
Yeah, bless. It was a very touching moment, because if I honestly thought to myself, God, if I'm seeing this, then Nichole is feeling some feelings. Like, we've been friends for years now, and it's just like an acknowledgement that I just have. I know it, that Nichole is, she always has her shit together outside. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so to kind of see her, a case of the wet eyes, I was like, oh shit, we are all in this. Like, it really felt like a sort of like, oh no, the plates have stopped spinning for like a brief moment. We'll pick them up shortly. But right now, I think the plates have demanded to be put down. So we're just going to honor that and put the plates down.
Yep. And that's a powerful moment the first time you're able to cry around someone.
I mean, it's a lot of things. And like, it's never a case of doubt that Nichole feels things. It's never that. But I think it's just also, sometimes it just kind of comes out. And it's I'm glad she did it with us. It felt nice and safe. But I also understand that sometimes you just get a little bit overwhelmed, because any number of outside variables have all kind of collided in your own body. So it's like a number of things meeting some stuff at your own place, and you're just kind of like, you know what, I'm done. And so it's just, it was kind of, bless her heart. It was actually a really lovely moment of just like being inside something, and I felt very close to her. I was like, oh look, this is the result of something emotional, because she just done something very emotional on the show, written something really lovely, and I was complimenting her, and I was like, oh my God, and she just started crying, and I was like, rah, that never happens. So bless your heart. Exactly. So but yes, I felt really kind of like, I said, oh my God, it's a breakthrough. And she kind of laughed me. But it really was kind of just like, I think it was just a feeling of just being friends with someone and being able to just in the moment kind of feel very connected to them, because it then made me also get wet eyes, and I was like, oh my God, there's so much love in this Zoom right now. And it was very
I was like, the wet eyes were contagious.
Exactly.
And to know that it was such a moment of connection when there's been so much like you said, like horror lurking behind everything, that the thing that did finally make Nichole cry was something like beautiful and connected. I'm like,
right.
My heart.
That was nice. That was very nice. Yes, I will say.
Oh yes, it was a nice set of compliments from them, and I don't know, they just moved me, and then I just ended up trying not to cry and failing.
Yeah. And I think it was just like to kind of fit in with all of 2020 as well. It's just this feeling of overwhelmedness. Like at every turn, there is like a new horror lurking, waiting to be unfolded or waiting to be unwrapped. And you're just like, Jesus, like what now? And I think a part of you is kind of like, well, if I start crying, I'll never stop. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you have to pick a moment, but sometimes the moment picks it for you, and it's like, now is the time. I'm going to do it right now. And you're like, all right, go with God. Like this is a thing that we're doing right now.
Because I am very much I don't know. I try to be very silly and goofy with my friends, and I don't know. I mean, your friends are there to be vulnerable with you, but I still don't want to be a burden.
Mm.
So I try to hold on to all of it, and then it leaks out because somebody was nice to me.
oh no, you've been kind. Here's some feelings.
Yes, exactly. And I think also it just speaks to, I just need some sweetness in my life, right now. I think we all do. And so what Bim said was really sweet and kind and thoughtful. And it was just what I needed. So it just like flipped a little switch inside.
Yeah.
It's also just like, it's sad that someone being nice to me would make me cry. And I'm like, I don't want to talk to my therapist about this.
You're like, it's like that meme of that penguin just like sad, slapping a heart and glitter onto a card. Like, I guess I'm going to have to address these nice feelings now.
Basically, Nichole is angry Pingu right now.
Yes.
Yep. Well, it's tough. And I always remind people that like your friends actually like to be there for you when you're having bad feelings. Because how good does it feel when like your friend comes to you and they're upset and you're the one that helps them? You're like, I'm a superhero. And like, you have to give your friends those opportunities though, because if you're always like, oh, I'm fine, your friend's like, well, what am I doing here?
Right.
Yeah.
That was my reaction today. I was like, yes, cry, Nichole, cry.
Weep how good I am.
Exactly. You're welcome, Nichole.
Thanks. And I think the pandemic and being quarantined has also affected, to kind of get back to the heart of your podcast here, one of my hobbies that I wanted to restart. So around February, I'd started buying cameras and camera equipment and stuff like that, because I do dabble in very amateur photography. I have never taken a class. I keep saying I'm going to take a class, but I haven't done it. So I've just been trying to learn photography for a very, very long time. And I said that I was going to start again. So I started buying stuff and was really looking forward to spring because I could get out and start taking pictures and go on walks and all this kind of stuff. And then quarantine happened. So I was not able to go out. And even though I adopted a cat in April, there are only so many pictures of her that I can take. That I'm just like, I would actually like to take pictures of, people and like being outside. And, a lot of vacation plans and working vacation plans, of course, were canceled. And I was definitely looking forward to, doing some touristy stuff, taking some touristy type pictures. And so all of that got pushed to the side. And now as things are opening up, I've tried to bring my camera with me to certain places. And the first outing that my friends and I went to, I brought my camera. So I took pictures of Bim and our other friends. And so that was nice. But it just was, I definitely have to warm up that muscle again, of getting in the zone of taking pictures and feeling comfortable to take pictures of strangers, particularly, even though everyone has a camera on their phone now and everyone's always recording something, there's still something to be said about making sure the people you're taking pictures of are actually okay with you taking pictures of them. So I'm still very conscious of that. Also, I'm a little older, so I still have like manners, and I still want to be like, oh, it's okay if I take this picture of you, but then I also have to deal with, no, I want them to be as natural as possible in this environment. So there are all these things going on, and I have to like rebuild that muscle, rebuild that sense of being able to take a picture quickly without them realizing that I'm taking the picture, so they don't pose and all that kind of stuff. So I'm looking forward to getting back out there at some point to actually take pictures again, and relearn this, and maybe hopefully actually take an actual class, so that I can learn stuff. Because what I'm learning on my own is, I don't know, it's very slow going, but I do want to take an actual class and learn all the doodads and doohickeys that are on my camera.
Not like having a good command of your camera, then it kind of dovetails with what you're talking about of then like a lot of what you're talking about sounds almost like the interpersonal documentation through pictures. And once you have a command of your equipment, you can then access more of those interpersonal skills more quickly because you're not like, oh, let me figure out what's going on with like the f-stop on my camera. You're like, okay, gonna do that really fast, and then I can actually attend to what I'm photographing.
Because a lot of stuff that I take pictures of, and the people, I post them or I'll share them and people like them, they're kind of happy accidents, or they're just something I may have actually pictured how I want it to look in my head, and it may turn out like that, but I don't know the language of how I am picturing the pictures. So I would like to learn the language and be able to talk about stuff, because I've even like maybe over 10 years ago now, I shot a friend's wedding, and obviously it was a very small, intimate thing. And the pictures did turn out well. But people then were kind of like, oh, how did you shoot this? What f-stop? Actually asking me, what f-stop did you use for this? I'm like, I don't know. I just, I just know how I wanted it to look and I made it happen. So I would like to be able to talk intelligently about this hobby one day.
Well, it sounds like it's in line with storytelling, like whether it's writing or podcasting or photography. It sounds like you've got the storytelling bit down and you're like, oh, I'd like to learn more about the actual tools behind this.
Yes. Storytelling is very important to me. And I guess, yes, photography is another way for me to do that. And yeah, I've always been fascinated with it. I remember when I was a little girl and I had my 110 camera and just taking pictures. And I really liked the sound of advancing the film as well. All the technical stuff with it. But I have a brother and a sister, so it's three of us, and my mother, was basically raising us alone at the time. And I just didn't want to burden her with constantly like, can you go get my film developed? Those kinds of requests. And obviously I was very little and didn't have a way of making money. So I put photography on hold for a very long time. And then once I became an adult and could actually afford to have, luxury income, I guess you could say. And I went back into photography. And again, I liked it. I like portraits, but I also like getting really up close on stuff, doing the macro photography. And I think that kind of speaks to my writing style, where I like to zoom in on one particular thing so that it's very specific, but because it's so specific, so many people can appreciate it and relate to it. So that's how I feel with macro photography, that, once people realize, oh, this is a strawberry seed or something, I don't know, but once they realize that's what it is, then they kind of like zoom out to see the rest of the picture. And that's how I want to see, that's how I kind of want my writing, particularly my poetry, to be received.
I love that. And I love that idea of like that it is the detail, it is the macro lens that weirdly enough then makes things micro, which makes things macro again. My mind just like went to all these images of like lenses zooming in and out and the metaphorical meaning thereof. And I'm like, well, you have taken me to a place. Oh my goodness. And are you experiencing when you are out and about, like, I guess that would inform what you're even taking pictures of, because the spring probably looks very different than you anticipated.
Right. So again, I feel limited. I don't want to just keep taking pictures of people walking by on the streets. There's beauty in that, and there's something interesting in that, but I was really looking forward to all the different things that I could have taken pictures of. And so I'm trying to adjust my mind, particularly because when I'm out, I do just have one thing that I'm trying to do before I can hurry up and get back inside. And I do have a compromised immune system, so I'm trying to be very conscious of that and make sure that I am still protecting myself as well as others. So when I am out, it's very much, okay, I'm going out to this outdoor bar with my friends. This is pretty much all that we can do. And then we have to hurry up and get back inside. And so I'm also trying to make sure that I'm enjoying the time with my friends while I'm out, and not just like, okay, yeah, haha, it's great to see you. Let me see what subjects I can find to take pictures of. I want to honor the time that we're having together, since we haven't been able to spend so much time together. Well, but I also want to, kind of look around and see what's available to me to take pictures of.
Yeah, and trying to balance that when it's like both are kind of scarce.
Right.
I'm glad that you even talked about like the idea of having a compromised immune system in this scenario, where people who don't have that experience even still have a patina of kind of anxiety about socializing right now, about being out and about, because there are so many risks that you have to constantly be calculating. And that even going outside is a risk. And so it's like, well, what kind of risk do you want to assume? And then once you're running that kind of in your background script, then how do you enjoy being with your friends? How do you enjoy making art?
Right. So there's all these things that are constantly running in your mind. And so to be able to just, enjoy the moment of friendship that we haven't had in a long time is very, it's very precious. So I want to try to make sure that I honor that and stay present, even as I am clicking away sometimes on my camera.
When you were talking about the sound of film advancing, I had bought a disposable camera at some point in the last year and realized that like even just that sound of turning the wheel for the film is so satisfying.
It is. It's just a nice little, it's like it's a heavy but quick click. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yes. Like, I love that sound. I was wondering, how do both of you feel as storytellers during this time? Because you do have the podcast coming out every Thursday, and that definitely keeps you moored in kind of like the space-time continuum. But like, what is it like being storytellers right now?
I have two jobs. So we make first aid kits and have done for a few years now. And I love doing it. I love working with Nichole. I love being able to kind of spin very specific yarns on our show and go down very specific roads that we have ourselves chosen, but also where the subject leads us. So that's always very nice. And then in my other job, I work on a radio show that also goes out as a podcast. And that is rooted in a much more traditional storytelling, beginning, middle, end, as a theme. And so one feeds the other. And I think that's like a nice, I think I'm very lucky to kind of have an outlet that kind of feeds very different beasts, but still kind of amounts to the same thing, which is making, really lovely, warm, human radio and audio sounds in general. And it's nice that I get to kind of switch modes where for oftentimes on This American Life, I am not even necessarily on the radio. I'm producing off radio. So there's a lot of backstage stuff that I get to do, listen to tape and edit and all that other stuff. And then I get to occasionally host the show from time to time whenever Ira is not able to do it and is like, hey, you should do it. And that feels nice to be able to kind of use my voice on that particular thing. But I'm also really happy doing that in the way that we do on First Aid Kit. So it feels nice that I haven't stopped telling stories. And when we first kind of came indoors, and we came indoors in March, and we haven't been back to the office in any kind of solid way since, there was a worry that, oh gosh, are we going to be able to do it? I brought my massive desktop home with me so I can edit on a much larger screen without having to kind of squint and ruin my eyes on Pro Tools on my laptop.
I know this vibe so well. Yes.
Right. So there was this worry of kind of like, sure, we can make radio, but will it sound the same? Will it be extra difficult? Will it take on all sorts of new, potentially terrible forms and so on. And, there was an adjustment period. And the same with Thursday Kit, where we, Nichole and I, so much of what we do is reliant on our in-person chemistry. Like we're really good friends in real life, but also there's something that's added when we're both in the same room and we are able to kind of track expressions on each other's faces and are able to kind of gauge something, or there's a lot of spontaneous laughter on the show, and it's often triggered by somebody spotting the other person doing something out the side of their eye, and it's like and so it felt really, even and the energy of having our producer outside the booth kind of directing us from that as well, like once that's gone, it's like, oh, how do we can we recreate that? Can we do that still? And it turns out, thankfully, we can. And I don't say that to kind of like talk about how great we are, because the thing is, I have listened to some podcasts where, the hosts are friends, and you're like, man, you could have fooled me, because I do not feel that chemistry. And like, I know you guys are friends in real life, but I'm not feeling it. And then we were worried that something would go if one or both of us were in our homes. But actually, it's been great, and we have different ways of doing it. When we first came home, we would just do voice only, and then we kind of incorporated video. So we record separately, and then we also kind of have the call over Zoom so we can see one another, and that really helps as well. So in terms of the storytelling itself, there was a period of adjustment, and then we kind of settled into where we've been for most of the run of episodes that we've done since we've been home.
Yeah. And you mentioned something that's so interesting about the interpersonal chemistry that happens when you're in the same room with someone. That, like, it sounds like you were able to kind of capture that spark even though you're in separate places, but that's kind of that undefinable thing that, like you said, you can feel that energy when people are talking on a podcast. And like you said, even when they're good friends, you're like, are you though?
Right. It's a thing that and I have to kind of not be a snob about it and kind of be like, ugh, we do it so much better. It's like, well, actually, there's different ways of doing whatever. And I think what we were worried about was maintaining that very specific energy of, Thursday Kit and the discussions that we have on the show. And would that work if we weren't able to kind of like occasionally slap each other's arm across the desk, or kind of throw our head back and really laugh in a very full-throated way? And, there's all the issues of timing and technology. And it's like, wait, this joke is on a delay, and you just got what I was, oh no. So there was that worry, and we were kind of ironing stuff out. But I think we really have settled back into a groove where, and shout out to our listeners who are also very accommodating of the fact that we are making a podcast in very different circumstances to what they're used to.
Right.
They've been quite generous and very warm. And, every so often we send out an apology. Apologies for the echo or the tinny sound, or sometimes Nicole's cat, who is very noisy, will pop by for a little time on the podcast. And I'm like, sis, sit down, please. But again, people have been incredibly forgiving and very generous. I think there's an understanding that we're all experiencing some level of upheaval, and sometimes that will bleed out into your headphones, but it's not the end of the world. You'll be fine. Just power through it as we are.
Well, there's been almost this, I was talking to another guest about this, about like how we used to have this mythos about creators, that it's like they're somehow creating somewhere on a lovely cloud where they eat pure inspiration. And now we've all seen that, like, no, we're all a bit messy and human, and that in some ways actually has made people engage with art even more when they're like, oh, you have funky audio too sometimes. Okay.
And like, waiting for the perfect circumstances is not how most creative people create. Like, I think often about that thing about the pram in the hall. But it's like everyone is juggling something at the best of times. No one is ever doing one thing purely. You're doing everything. And actually, in the best case scenario, the other things you do end up feeding into the main thing that you do, right?
Yes.
And that's the same thing with the problems. If there's a small problem in one place, it tends to amplify across all the things that you do. But it doesn't mean you stop doing it. It means that you modify and try and find a way to kind of balance and keep it going.
I'm nodding sagely. This is getting...
I felt your nod. I felt it.
Oh, yes. I feel like sometimes when I'm interviewing people, because that's a great idea, by the way, with the video, I sometimes feel like I'm playing like a role-playing game where you have to type in the physical actions that you do. And it almost feels like in the early 90s, like kind of like those text games where it's just like,
Yes.
I step once to the left.
Yes. I love those games. But yes, it does feel like you are at a remove.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very strange. And I'm curious, how did that inform changing what you did production-wise on This American Life? Because that, like you said, that show does have such structure to it. But it's like people know what to expect with that show. It must have been a really interesting transition to go through with that.
I mean, we have such amazing people working behind the scenes. Like all the voices that you hear on the show are amazing, but so many of the voices are just not ever on the air. But they're the ones who kind of set out a whole new system about here's how we do recorded interviews, and this is how, because it was so clear that we weren't going to go outside into the world and get our interviews the usual way, where you go with your recorder and you go with your producer and you have a chat and blah, blah, blah. And that was in itself a really, because the first few weeks, it was just a bunch of questions. Wait, what do I do? How does this work? Wait, how do I play? How do we do the edits? How are you going to hear the audio? How are you blah, blah, blah? So there was a lot of kind of back and forth and trying to figure out the best way, and also to do it at the highest quality with the understanding that the world is different currently. So I mean, we get the occasional email kind of going, how are you guys still making radio? And I'm like, aha, it's the radio fairy. It's very magical. But of course, it's not the radio fairy. It's a bunch of really hardworking people who are testing multiple systems to see what works. Like, I think often about how before this pandemic, almost no one had heard of Zoom. And now we know it enough to use it as a verb, so that's basically what our sound engineers and everybody else at the show is doing a number of tests on different platforms, trying to find the best quality sound, the stuff that feels like you are in the room, even though clearly you are not. And that has been a really interesting thing to kind of see people collect reports from across the country, sometimes outside of the country. And it's all done by a phone or, VoIP or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing as well. Like, I feel like it's expanded a bunch of skill sets as well. So it's not all bad.
Yeah, like when Nichole was talking about kind of capturing people candidly, in a way, it's almost the same thing, like trying to capture stories candidly without letting the technology necessarily interrupt it, even though it's almost like you have to kind of forget the technology is there.
Right, but you can't, because you every so often in the middle of an interview, you're like, sorry, can you just make sure you've got the headphones plugged in? There's any echo. And someone's telling you like an emotional story, and you're like, oh my God, that sounds terrible. Quick thing, could you just increase the volume just a little bit? In a way that you could self adapt if you were in the room. You'd move the mic yourself, or you'd go there, you know what I mean? And suddenly it's kind of like, it feels like we're roping in a lot of our interviewees into the production system. I'm just kind of like, I'm producing you, but also could you produce yourself just a tiny bit,
just a teeny weensy bit,
right? Yeah. And that's been a weird little curveball to kind of, and I imagine for the contributors as well, it's like, wait, what? And so many of them, again, it's such a clear understanding that so many of us only know the technology that we know. And once it's outside of that comfort zone, you're kind of like, wait, what? And that's been true for us. I can only imagine it's true for people who aren't audio professionals as well.
That's so funny what you said about Zoom, and it sparked in my mind like the evolution of language, because prior to this I had used Zoom in my professional practice as a therapist because it was HIPAA compliant, but I did have to educate clients on what Zoom was, so that when they were traveling and wanted to have sessions, I'm like, oh, this has clear audio quality and it's also privacy compliant. And that all of a sudden, I feel so like at the beginning of this, I felt bizarrely vindicated that I was just like, yes, now you shall all know. Because people have been like Skype or FaceTime. I'm like, oh no.
Yeah, well, we all caught up finally.
And now it is strange that it's a verb. I hadn't even thought of that because I verb things frequently without thinking about it.
Right.
I do too.
It's like, I don't know what that says about me, that I want to take words and turn them into action. But
right.
that's fascinating to think about also, like both sides of it, that you are, you know, both of you in some ways are kind of in the front person role where you are hosts, but also both of you are in both of your other endeavors, like the behind the scenes person almost. Like obviously the photographer does influence what's in the image and the producer influences what turns out in the show. But what people see is like the end result, like they see the photograph or they hear the show.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I was wondering, I was like, do you like that duality of like in some ways being the front person and in other ways being like, whoa, no, I'm the magician behind the curtain over here?
I prefer to be behind the curtain. It's one of the reasons I was very frustrated with my previous career in education. I thought that I wanted to be a teacher, but I realized it was just because that's what people were telling me that I should be doing. And I did not enjoy being in front of the classroom. So from after I tried to be a teacher for a second, which, you know, I did enjoy interacting with the students and teaching, but I did not enjoy being in front of the classroom. So that was difficult for me. So I just ended up going behind the scenes and getting involved in administration and curriculum building and things like that, so that I'm still able to be, so that I was still able to be a part of students' lives, but not in front of them. So when it comes to doing the podcast, or even my writing, and yes, photography, I like being behind the camera. One of the reasons that I picked up a camera finally in my adulthood was it was a good way to avoid taking pictures, like having people take pictures of me, because I don't like people taking pictures of me. And so I was like, okay, well, I can control the situation if I'm the one taking the pictures. And so that added to me trying to learn photography more. And so in the podcast world, I love being behind the mic, which is not in front of the camera. You know, like I like being able to have these messy scripts, you know, that we write out, that we build, and I can, you know, scratch all through when I'm looking at them, and nobody sees that. They just see the final product, or what they hear is the final product of that. So I prefer being behind the scenes, but knowing that all the stuff in front could not happen without me. So that's still how I get my ego boost. You know, some people are made to be in front of the camera to get all the accolades and to get all the fame. I want to be the person who, you know, makes the fame for someone else happen, I guess. And you know, that it's still an important role.
Yes. Like pay attention to me, but like from over there.
Yes, exactly. Which is, you know, Bill brought up my cat, but I am very much a cat-like person that way, where I'm, you know, pay attention to me, but I'm going to be over here in the corner. And if you stop paying attention to me, even though I'm ignoring you, I'm going to be very upset. So that is me in a nutshell.
That's deeply relatable. My neighbor's cat adopted me, and I'm actually allergic to cats, much like I'm allergic to everything. But I'm slowly acclimating with the use of Zyrtec, because she's very much, she wants to be in my home. And thankfully she'll occasionally be affectionate, but frequently she actually will sit across my home from me, but want to be there. She will meow if I do not let her in. She'll meow, she'll jingle her collar, she'll like scratch at the door. She does all the things to come in.
Right.
But she only wants to be proximal. It's like she would like to be admired from afar. But like, and I'm like, I respect this so much, because that's so me. It's like, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at, oh, from over there. Look at me.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
That's far enough. Stay where you are. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you for the admirers. I'll just be over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I very much relate to that. And it is gratifying then when you see the project kind of like take flight, or you see someone succeed and you're like, ah, yes, I know in my heart that's because of me.
Yes.
My favorite drug. Yes. It's a great feeling.
Yes, yes. And it's such, and I was wondering, Bim, if that's how you feel like when episodes launch of This American Life, to be like, I did that.
I mean, I am wildly egotistical about my work and only my work. So I am really happy when I do have that moment of like, oh yeah, I directed that, or oh yeah, I produced that thing. You know, especially because sometimes when I'm producing, you don't hear me at all. I'm just,
Of course.
sometimes producers produce and they are also like the reporter in the piece. But a lot of the time, my experience so far has been that I produce pieces that I'm not actively in, so you don't hear me at all. But there is for me, there's always been a thing of pride for me. Like, you know, I come from print journalism, so you always have a byline.
Mm-hmm.
But every so often, you know, I started out as a writer, then I went into editing, and now I'm kind of a bit of both in the middle. And every time a piece that I edited kind of got like good feedback, or somebody would pull out a paragraph and kind of go, oh, I love this. And I'm like, I did that, thanks. You know, and that's like a really nice feeling still to have. And when people kind of compliment the show, even when I haven't worked on the show that week, I'm like, thank you so much. Thanks. We work very hard. Thank you. You know, like it's a real feeling of just like, oh, I'm part of a machine. Like I am a cog in a machine, and what we put out finds a place in people's ears and hearts, hopefully. And that's like a source of really great pride for me.
I love that. And thinking about even like the topic of Thirst Aid Kit, that it's like, it's such a vulnerable topic that you two are discussing as well. And so when that finds, like when it emotionally lands, it must be very gratifying.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's really affirming when our listeners let us know that we have helped them through something difficult. You know, because that was not the purpose. That was not what we were shooting for when we started doing the show, or even just talking about it. We didn't have any kind of grand plan to be like, we are going to help people get through the most difficult times of their lives. You know, it was nothing like that at all. We just wanted to be able to give people, especially women, a place to express their desires. And, you know, so when they write us, when they DM us, when they email us, when they tweet us, when they send us messages on Tumblr, when they go to our personal Twitters, like they're just all everywhere they can find us, they will find us. But when they do and they tell us something like, you know, I was having a really hard time with my breakup with my boyfriend, but now I realize that, you know, it's okay for me to have this healthy crush on this person that I'll never meet or whatever. Or even when something is a bit more serious, when survivors write in to tell us that we're kind of helping them give themselves permission to desire men again, in a safe way, in a way that they can control. That really touches us. Like we have, you know, kind of gotten these emails and then looked at each other like, holy crap, this is what our show is doing. You know, that kind of stuff. We get DMs from people who identify as asexual, who are just like, this isn't really my wheelhouse, but I like what you're doing, and you're giving me a way to express what feelings I do have in a way that I wasn't expecting. So all this kind of stuff, just we really appreciate that. And we love it. We're very grateful for that kind of feedback. It does make us feel good. It does make us feel like we're not just talking, you know, to each other. And, you know, for a while that was a concern of mine, that it was just, you know, here's this thing that we were doing because we like doing it, which is enough. But it's also just like, but is anybody else out there going to understand what we're trying to do? And it has been great to know that people do understand us. They get us, they love us, and they love the work that we do.
Well, and you're speaking to something that often isn't spoken to. Like female desire is very threatening and misunderstood and maligned often in our culture, or is made into a joke where it's like that someone's desperate. And so I love that you speak to desire as something that's healthy and multifaceted and fascinating and funny. And I think that that might unleash something in people that, you know, like I love that you were talking about people that might be on the ACE or ARO spectrum that don't necessarily have words to talk about what they feel. Like one of my friends is telling me about, like, you know, kind of having an aromantic crush and calling it like a squish.
I like that. I like that.
I love that term. I was just like, oh, I have felt that before, where you're not romantically into someone, but boy, are you into them.
Yeah.
I was like, a squish. I will now have a word for that. And so it is, I think trying to think of how to phrase it. It's like, you know, you've hit on a good idea when you're expressing quite accidentally, even like a universal experience that people are having, where they're like, oh, I wish I had thought about desire this way. And now you're talking about it. Now I can think of it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. And that's really, I'm like, that's so touching that you are able to reach people like that. And it would be very, I personally at least think it would be deranged if someone's like, I'm going to start a podcast to change other people's lives.
Right. Yeah.
Are you though? That sounds a little like megalomaniacal.
A little bit, yeah.
Like just a tiny.
And that's a thing that happens a lot too with our show. And people kind of come in and say, oh, I thought X, but actually I listened to a couple of episodes and you do Y. And we're like, yeah, we know. Like so much of what we're doing. I think people really have this, and I understand why. It doesn't make it any less frustrating, but I think people really believe that podcast people go into a studio, chat shit for an hour, and then peace out. And then that is just like what you get in your ears. And you can see the surprise when people kind of go, oh God, that was a really thoughtful interview. And we're like, yeah, we know. It's a really weird thing when people have certain expectations of your work, and then they're forced to kind of confront the reality of your work. Mm-hmm. And then it's a case of just like, oh, I was wrong. And, you know, it's very hard not to be completely churlish, but I was kind of like, yeah, okay, well, welcome to the correct side of history. But also it would have cost you so little to do a tiny bit of research beforehand. There's a feeling that all the elements that make us are in separate silos. Mm. And the reality, of course, is that there's a lot of mixing of the grain, actually. And, you know, one thing informs the other, which informs another, and so on and so forth. And it's like an endless loop of all your influences. Like when people say that thing about, you know, oh, what's your writing style? And the answer, of course, is that your writing style, while yours, is also an amalgamation of every of your favorite writers. Mm-hmm. And what comes out is some sort of alchemical situation, right? And I think about that in terms of our podcast, but also in life in general. Like no one is living like completely separate from everyone else. When people kind of have a thought, it's kind of like, that was definitely your independent thought, but it is for sure influenced by the same cultural soup that a bunch of us are swimming in, you know? And maybe you got there first, or maybe you whatever, because I do think, you know, when we talk about our podcast as well, we did our pilot in 2017. And we've been talking about it for months before then. And sorry?
I said, oh, wow. Like I didn't, like, I'm like, tell me more, basically.
Yeah. So again, when people kind of talk about female desire and how it's been misunderstood for so long, of course, we're not the first. But, you know, I also think about the ways that Nichole and I and our producers over the years sat down to kind of shape this show. And what we were doing, as well as wanting to say what we wanted to say, was also to kind of address the things that people hadn't said. So there is a lot of kind of like filling in an absence, but also kind of synthesizing what's present already and putting it into a sort of format that I do think has influenced many other podcasts in terms of how they talk about stuff, or even the way their own format kind of fits into what we helped to kind of like pioneer. And that's very thrilling for me as well, to understand, you know, the sudden kind of explosion of podcasts where people are kind of talking about specific things that perhaps they had thought they couldn't before. Mm-hmm. That gives me a really warm sense of satisfaction and like a good amount of like, good feeling that, we did do something here. And that was not the intention. Like Nichole said, we weren't out here kind of like sitting down and having a summit. Like, so how do we change podcasting? You know? But it's nice to kind of have the acknowledgement of people say directly to us, oh my God, you inspired me to do X, or, you know, and it happens in our inbox every day in a much smaller way, where people say, oh my God, I wrote my first bit of fanfic. Thank you so much for kind of sort of giving me permission to do it. And it's like, fam, it was always there. But I'm glad we were the spur that kind of led you down this particular road.
Yeah, it's like you're the catalyst, and in a way, like when you see someone else doing something that's even that seems unattainable or that seems shameful, like to express, and you see someone else express it, it kind of dispels that shame and emboldens you to be able to engage with it as well.
Right.
And so if you're like, well, I guess if they're putting themselves out there, maybe I can do it a teeny tiny bit myself.
Right. And that's very much the tenor of some of the messages we get, where it's kind of like, I don't know what I was doing before I listened to you guys. Thank you so much for validating. That is a common word in the emails. Like, thank you for validating. Oh my God, I thought I was the only one who felt this way. Oh my God, everyone else too. Like, there's a current, somebody sent a message into our Tumblr talking about how much they fancied Hawkeye from MASH.
Mm-hmm.
and they were met with enthusiasm by us replying on Tumblr. And then, of course, other people were like, oh my God, I thought it was just me. Oh my God, Alan Alda. Oh my God. And it's like, aha, see? And we say it all the time. The Church of Thirst is very broad. There is room for all sorts of denominations. But every so often you find, like the Baptists find other Baptists and the Episcopalians find their own group. And it's like, aha, this is the road that we can go down. And we say it often too, like, we don't fancy everybody you fancy, and you don't fancy everyone we fancy. And so the podcast is not about prescribing something. It's about giving you, hopefully anyway, tools to kind of examine, because that's like the key thing we want to do. We want to talk about the thirst object. We want to talk about women's desire, especially to Black women. But also, we're not here to tell you how to feel. We just want you to kind of go forth, do it happily, but also question certain things. Like, why do I fancy this person? And what we do on the show is break down, for us anyway, the whys of a person's allure. Like, there are so many things that go into it. And we don't shy away from examining some of the things that might be kind of harmful. Nichole talks often about how she feels a very strong urge to kick against the idea of fancying someone who is blonde with blue eyes, because for so long that was the idea of the ideal kind of beauty. And if you're pushing against that because in the world that you live in, you are somehow seen as not desirable,
right?
It takes on a very different kind of tenor. And I feel the same way, where I'm kind of like, on principle, I can't fancy that blonde man because fuck that, And that's like an interesting perspective to bring. And then to have listeners who are not Black women and kind of go, I never really thought about X. And we're like, aha, thank you for listening.
Right. So, we understand why it happens, but for so many people to describe the show as us just talking about hot men, that's not what we do. And so what we try to do at the very heart is get people to examine, why they like who they like. And so we kind of push at that, is this guy really good looking to you, or is he just tall and white? And what does that mean, that it's enough that he is tall and white and that's all he needs to be considered attractive? So we try to get people to just, after they're through laughing at us and our silly auntie laughs and all this kind of stuff, after they're through with all of that, we want them to just kind of examine their own, what they've allowed themselves to like. And is that really what they like, or is that just what they've been told that they're supposed to like, and then go from there?
Have either of you read Pleasure Activism?
No, I have not.
I just lit up with the excitement of a book. She touches on this concept a lot. It's a collection of essays about pleasure and where we find pleasure and why it's a radical idea to even be able to experience pleasure, and why it's powerful. And a lot of it does explore, like, where did we get the notions of who we're supposed to like, what's acceptable, what's desirable, and then what makes you desirable in turn. It's fascinating, and you can kind of move around throughout different parts of the book because it's mostly essays and conversation, so it's non-linear. But it does touch on those ideas of like why we like what we like, and why sometimes we don't find ourselves desirable because of what we're told we're supposed to like. Now I just want to nerd out about this book, and I'm trying to so I'm like, keep it in, ADHD Schaefer, keep it in. And you touched on something when you were talking about that with the nature of who you desire. And in a way, you're being really vulnerable in sharing this with people, because in a way, you're sharing what you find desirable about yourself too.
Yes. Yes. I tend to overshare anyway. Like I consider myself a confessional writer, so I am used to kind of like exposing parts of my life. But the show definitely has made me present more of myself than I anticipated. And I mention this, often on the show, that I was like, oh, I didn't think I would be revealing that today. But yeah, it's definitely made me, share stuff that I would not normally. Like there is a drabble that I wrote for Jake Gyllenhaal that still gets a lot of feedback. It's been maybe, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years.
Maybe longer, yeah.
Yeah. And so whenever someone finds the show or they're new to the show and they get to that drabble, they light us up because they're so overwhelmed by it. But basically the drabble was me being very vulnerable about not having straight, perfect teeth. And so many people could relate to that, and what it means when you don't have, perfect Hollywood teeth and you're trying to kiss someone who does. Yeah, that was not something that I expected that I would share, but I did. And I guess I needed to, because again, a lot of people were like, oh my God, me too. So I really appreciated that being open and being vulnerable paid off, even if it helped someone else realize that they also had the same issues.
Yeah, especially, because of what you were talking about, of what's desired in our culture, and then who you're allowed to desire and engage with because of the qualities you have. And may I share a secret with you?
Please. Sure.
I went to high school with Jake Gyllenhaal and had a crush on him when I was like 12.
Oh my gosh.
Full circle. I love that detail. That's lovely.
I love it.
He was a few grades ahead of me, and I definitely wrote in my journal. It's quarantine time, so of course I went through my old journals.
Of course.
Because that's an unhinged decision to make. There's definitely mention in my journal saying that I hope that he becomes famous because he's so talented. And I was like, oh yes.
Bless your heart. What a generous childlike wish for him. That's so sweet. Bless you. Oh, that actually says more about you than anything we've done today. I love that so much. Just the purity of that feeling. I hope he makes a success of this. God bless him. That's so sweet.
I guess that really does. And I just was like, yeah, he should. If any of us should make it, it really should be him.
That's so sweet and pure.
It really is. Bless.
So I'm here to quite accidentally validate any thirst for Jake Gyllenhaal.
Excellent. We love to see it. That's great. And so it also helps to kind of nail down the feeling that we had, which is that he is a very talented, very weird actor. And so it felt really nice to kind of have people respond to that particular trouble, but also to have you kind of confirm that, yeah, he definitely has star quality. That's pleasing to me personally.
That's really funny. And he's one of the few people from my high school I haven't run into in LA, though now we aren't running into anybody.
Right. It's not that kind of city anymore.
No.
Blimey. Yeah.
I miss, someone had written about like I think that they called it the city fuck around, where you just kind of like go out for one thing, but then like a myriad of other things happen, and all of a sudden the day has passed by and you end up with like a book and a flower vase and you really don't know what happened, but it was a wonderful day in the city.
Yep. That's always a nice, it's rather that than any number of alternatives. So
Yes.
Yes.
And I was just like, I haven't had a good one of those, because that is usually when you run into your high school classmates, when you completely least expect it, in the middle of a cafe and you're just reading and someone's like, hey, and you're like, ah. Or at least that happens to me, because I've looked the same since high school. And so I'm gravely alarmed when people recognize.
Yes, I've had the fortune of changing everything about my body. Like my face doesn't even look like my face anymore. So it's like, you look familiar. And I'm like, nope, don't know you, bye. So it's wonderful. Speeding through life. And it helps to also move country. You're not going to bump into a bunch of people when you're abroad. So that's my tip. That's my free tip and my free hack.
What tip?
Anyone? Yeah.
Pull a face up and move to another country.
Get out of town. Just go. You're fine.
Oh, I've had so much fun with the two of you. I really appreciate you coming by virtually over the internet.
Thank you. I'm so glad that it got to happen. It feels like we were trying to kind of get on one another's calendars for a very long time, but it happened, and this has been lovely as well. Thank you so much.
We did the thing. I just reached my arms out in victory, she says in the role-playing game of podcasting. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Why Not Both. If you liked what you heard, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, both on Instagram and on Twitter. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. Under the Radar is a nationally distributed print, music, and entertainment magazine and website. You can find them at www.undertheradarmag.com, and feel free to support them on Patreon. Extra special thanks to our producer, Laura Studeris, who is literally a rock star. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next episode.